Ever wonder how some financial services and fintech leaders learned about money when they were kids? Well, we've asked them 4 important questions to get their answers, and you definitely will want to hear them. Join me today as we hear from Jim Curran, Director of Know-How at the Cape Cod 5. Hey everyone, Mac Gardner here, author of Motivate Your Money and the global best-selling children's book, The Four Money Bears. I'm joined today by the one, the only Jim Curran, who is the Director of Financial Know-How for Cape Cod 5 Savings Bank. Jim, good to see you, my friend.
It's so good to see you too, Mac. Thank you for having me. Love the work that you do. So it's a pleasure to be on with you today. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Now, Jim, for those who do not know you and maybe aren't familiar with your cause and the amazing work you do, could you take a little time and share that with everyone, please?
Yeah, glad to answer it. So I'm again, as you said, I'm the Director of Financial Know-How at Cape Cod 5. And what that basically means is my job is to work in the community with advancement of financial know-how as my job description. So I do work in middle schools and in high schools, but I also work in employee wellness
Mm,
workshops as
mhm,
well, and
mhm.
really working with adults and even up to senior centers. So wherever somebody is looking for help in getting their budgets and their finances in order,
You're
that's where I
there.
come in. Yeah, exactly.
So, Jim, you have been on this journey to provide financial education for some time. The work that we're doing to develop the Four Money Bears into a game called Berryville, really excited to be rolling it out soon. It really got me to wondering, hey, these folks who are industry leaders and doing all this education, how did you learn about money
Yeah.
growing up? So I've got four really good questions for you here. Are you
Okay.
ready for question number one?
Game on.
All right, here we go. Jim, what was your earliest memory of financial education or financial literacy?
Oh, good question. I've got two that come to mind
Mm,
at the same time. First one is going to be just the first time my dad and I went into the bank and opened a
mm,
savings account.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
had one of those little pass books, and I just loved having that on my nightstand.
You were
And I
official.
knew where my paper route money was going exactly. But another thing comes to mind too, which is I remember being at a friend's house, and it
Mm,
was, the families visiting, and somebody down the street was selling a hockey goal, like a street hockey goal.
mm,
And I ran home and I asked my dad if it would be okay to buy it. And he
mhm,
said, Jim, it's your money. Like, you can buy whatever you want.
mhm.
And the sense of freedom I had as an
Uh,
11-year-old, that if I worked for it and I had the money, that
yep.
I could make those kinds of decisions, was really impactful. And it even reminds me of later on, I wanted to go out of state for college.
Mhm,
And my dad was like, I'm not sure we can pull this off. And I said, well, what if I got two jobs this summer?
mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
and I worked 60 hours a week all summer, and we just made it. And I was
yeah.
able to do what I was hoping I could do. But it started with that sense of, if I work for it, it's my money.
You know what I love about that story? We've done quite a few of these interviews now, Jim, and what really intrigues me is the folks that have this almost instant memory of
Yeah.
that connectivity and connect with money. They remember exactly what it was. But the
Yep.
thing that I also think is really neat is that connection with working for it, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't come to you. You have to put some effort into something, and then that leads to that saying to yourself, okay, you know what, all right, if I want this, I need to do this, and there's value associated with my time, which is then
Yes.
connected to earning the money. And now once you've earned it, now you got to manage it, but at least then you
Yeah.
have that initial connection of, hey, you know what, I got to work for this stuff. It's not just going to come to me freely. So that really leads to a second question that we have here, Jim, is what did money represent in
Mm.
your household when you were growing up?
For me, honestly, it represented anxiety.
Oh,
My family was very much paycheck to paycheck. I mean,
mhm.
my parents did the best they could,
Yeah.
and we were a blue collar family, and we were okay. We had a roof over our head and food in the fridge, but there was always that
Mhm,
stretch that
mhm,
you could feel.
mhm.
Every conversation was around money,
Yeah.
and and not being able to get the car fixed on time when you wanted to, and those types of things. And so um, I felt that even after I moved out, there was
Hmm.
just always an insecure relationship with money.
Yeah.
Um,
And how do you
I
think
think
that's the sort of it morphed into sort of what you're doing now and
for
and
sure,
and and your path? Talk a little
for
about that.
sure. Yeah, it was one of those things where I fell into a mistake where I thought if I made more money,
Mhm.
that anxiety would go away.
Mm,
But to your very good point, if I'm not managing that money the right way, I just felt like if I pay my bills on time, then I'm financially secure.
yeah.
But what happens when there's layoffs in the company?
Mhm.
What happens if I have a job that I don't like anymore, but I've got all of these bills now? And so it was not until much later that I developed a much healthier relationship with money. I would say in my 20s and 30s, that anxiety fed a different one, but it's also what inspired me.
Yeah.
Something I always say is like, it's very effective to learn from your own mistakes.
Sure.
It's far more efficient to learn from somebody else's.
Mhm.
So if they
Amen.
can learn from mine,
Yeah.
then that makes me feel good.
That's a great point. I'm thank you for the honesty. Thank you
Yeah,
for really because I think there's a lot of times these preconceived ideas that oh yeah, money is this great awesome thing, and no,
yeah,
for some folks, especially if we are in a society, and you could attest to this, if you were not ever provided the financial education,
for sure.
competence brings confidence. So if you're never
Yes,
provided the education, how do you
that's
think
right.
people can be out there just very super confident and not be anxious about
That's exactly right.
money and
Yeah,
financial
you're
things?
exactly right, Mac.
And then how do you pass that on to children, which really ties into our third question. Jim, how do you think we should teach young people about money?
Yeah, to me, it's about habits and
Mhm,
lifestyle.
mhm.
It's like playing outdoors or brushing your teeth, right? If I had to try to teach somebody who's 50
Yeah.
to do those things, that might be really hard. But if you grow up just assuming
Mhm,
that that's what you're supposed to do, it
mhm.
it probably sticks. So I would say make it a part of the allowance process.
Mhm.
If we give an allowance right in there, we also create a structure of okay, now what you do with that money. I want them to have choices
Yeah.
inside that structure, but as long as the structure includes what do you think you want to do in the next week? What
Mhm,
have you set aside for saving?
mhm.
What have you set aside to help take care of others? And as
Yeah.
long as they can make their decisions inside that loose structure,
The framework, yeah.
I think that would be a great way to start
Yeah.
with youngsters.
Two things that you said have really resonated with me is one, starting it early. I talk about socialization of things in our
Yes.
communities. There are things that are socialized very early: language,
Hmm.
food,
Hmm.
and religion. And
Yeah.
so, why isn't finance and learning about money socialized earlier?
It blows my mind, and the answer I think is that the previous generation doesn't know either.
Yeah, yeah,
And the previous generation to them doesn't know either.
yeah. And then, which
So
the
people are
second point
afraid.
is the conversations, and I think that's the other
Exactly.
issue that we have a lot in our society is that folks aren't comfortable talking
For
about
sure.
these things, and so we need to make it not as taboo. We need to make it something where we can just speak freely about it. And so I like your points, and I think they're very well served. Um, Jim, this is going to be probably a loaded question, seeing that this
Okay.
is what you do for a living.
I
But
think I'm ready.
what's the best advice you've ever been given when it comes to money?
Well, this will actually resonate with the beginning of our conversation. I think it was Morgan Housel, but I,
Mm,
I heard somebody say the best return on your money is peace of mind.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
think about all of the times lying in bed with the brain churning, like, how the heck am I going to pull this off?
mhm,
You know, and having a few months sitting in a savings account, whatever the interest rate is the interest rate.
mhm.
But knowing that I always have that fallback to be able to do the right thing. We were talking about financial literacy. There was a study that came out recently that I always talk to with students and with adults that showed a direct inverse correlation between financial literacy and how much you spend thinking about money.
Hmm.
And so the higher you did on a financial literacy test,
Mhm.
the better chance there was that you had emergency savings, and the
And the
less
less you
chance
thought about
there
money.
was that you spend thinking about money. And
Yeah.
to me, that's the definition of peace of mind.
Wow. That was so succinct. And that was so nice. No, it really was. I haven't heard that study. I'm glad
I'll send it
that
to
you
you.
share. Please, that'd be awesome. Glad you shared
Yeah.
with me because it's so true. It's one of those things where it's an inverse relationship. If you don't have to worry about it or think about it, hopefully it's because you already laid those tracks and those foundations, and you've been doing these things, and your money's working harder for you than you can work for your
Yes.
money, and you understand those concepts. Jim, as we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience as we kind of wrap up this conversation?
Just I love the fact anyone that is on this site, anybody that's working with your content, good for you. You are so ahead of the curve when it comes to setting
Mhm.
yourself up for success later in life. And the other thing I would say is what I was just meeting with some students at a high school here on Cape Cod last week.
Hmm.
And I said, no matter how well you do today, we were doing a credit for life fair and we
Mhm.
did some trivia. I said, please don't walk out of here thinking that you know it all now.
Mhm.
This is a lifelong journey. Be a lifelong learner. Be open to continuing to learn about this stuff and be open to it because, for me, it's a cycle breaking
Yeah.
thing for a lot of families, but also just what I'm hoping for is for people to be happy. And I know that happiness can come from that security that comes from knowing how to manage your money.
Amen, brother. Amen. And as I
Yeah.
like to say, Jim, the journey continues.
The journey continues. Exactly right, Mac. I'm going to steal that from you.
Thanks again for the time, Jim.
Cheers. Glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for our next engaging episode. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and visit www.thefourmoneybears.com.